Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 17th chapter of the first book of Chronicles. This chapter consists of two divisions, the first of which is Yahweh's revelation to Nathan, the prophet of David, and then David's response in prayer to the dialogues. We'll get to it when we get to it. But it's all prompted by him living in a palace of cedar, and he being a man after God's own heart. He longed to build He was perplexed that the Ark of the Covenant was not in a house at least as magnificent as his own. But the Ark of the Covenant, that takes us back to the 13th chapter. There we read that one of David's claims to fame was the recovery of the Ark of the Covenant. This was the physical vessel upon which was housed the 10 Commandments, the two tablets that have been written from the hand of Yahweh himself and given to Moses. And then in the 15th chapter we read that he builds his palace, and in the 14th chapter we read that it was the commercial connections with Hiram, the king of Tyre. The cedar was indigenous to Phoenicia, which lay to the north of Israel. Hiram was younger than David but older than Solomon, and he was an important ally to both of them. And but the 16th chapter returns to the ark, and this is where the 17th chapter begins. But we read in the first verse of the 16th chapter, "And they brought the ark of the Elohim and put it at the midst of the tent that David had pitched for it, and he brought burnt offerings and peace offerings before Yahweh." So it was now housed in the tent. Prior to the temple, there was only the tabernacle, which was a tent. So just imagine wandering across the wilderness, having to carry all these items. There was an ornate designs and architectures. This was no ordinary tent, but the fact that it was not a house yet was the cause of his consternation. But in any case, he does, make the most of the tabernacle, which is what he has in the absence of the temple. And there he goes through the motions of burning, going through sacrifices and burnt offerings and peace offerings are two separate things. But the important thing is that it's before Yahweh, and these two separate things are combined in one. And ultimately, there's some details. Now, the chronicler's emphasis is on the temple worship. And then, so that, David was a somewhat priestly figure in the sense that he organized a lot of the liturgical worship. He composed a lot of the Psalms. He really was a priestly figure without being quite a priest. But this is a personal prayer of David that he offered as king. It would have been appropriate on certain occasions for him to pray for the nation in the most sacred center. And there's a lot of stuff in this prayer. This prayer we also read that Asaph was there in the 7th verse. He's another psalmist, but that Asaph is post-exilic, but he may be a descendant of this Asaph. But it's from verses 8 through 36. We can only cover a few select items. We don't want to waste all our time in here, beginning with verse 11. "Seek Yahweh in his strength, seek his face continually. His strength is unlimited and inexhaustible, so whenever we are weak, whenever we are weary, we can find the strength we need by leading on him. And the way we have to do that is we have to seek him. So he is invisible and he cannot be found by the naked eye, the eyes of sight. But we have to thirst after him. So just our spiritual senses have to be driven by the desire to consume him continually. One and done, no more than a man should spend a life with a single prayer should he find the face and the blessings of God himself. One and done finality, he has to keep it going continually is the aim of the game. Verse 15, "Remember his covenant forever, the word he commands for 1,000 generations." The covenant that he is referring to is eternal because it springs from the eternal one. A covenant was the arrangement of agreement between two parties. It was always initiated. It was a political term, but it is theologized in the capital C term. And that's because this covenant, now it was a geopolitical term by which the stronger party would initiate the terms of agreement for the weaker party. But because there is no stronger power than Yahweh himself, that makes it a divine covenant. And because he is eternal, he is immutable, he is unchangeable, that means he will always end. And he just gives some history. He lists the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the 2 verses after that. We're going to go to the 23rd verse. Sing to Yahweh, all the earth. Proclaim his salvation from day to day. He's summoning the entire earth, all the people on it, not just Israel, to sing to him, to lift up their voices as one. This is an admittedly a species of unrealistic idealment, but it is a reflection of his heart's desire. But just proclaiming. Now, how can we proclaim his salvation from day to day? Well, we can't get lazy or lackadaisical. If we've shared our witness with one person, we have to look for another person in another way. Preach the gospel. Always use words only when necessary. So by the way we walk and the way we live, and you don't want to be overly aggressive in your evangelical overtures, but they will notice a certain thing in the way you act and way you behave, and they will ask you for your secret one day, and that's when you can confess that you're a Christian, and then just give your witness of how it has changed your life and invite them to have a similar experience. Verse 25, for great is Yahweh and greatly to be praised, and he is to be feared above all mighty ones. Because of his greatness demands that we praise him greatly. We have to offer all our faculties and all our capacities when we worship him, use all our minds, all our mights, all our spirits, all our souls, because his greatness demands no less, and it is fitting and appropriate to praise him who is alone worthy of praise. And before he is the single indisputable God, these other mighty ones were just figments of imaginations. They were gods made in the image of man, whereas the one who is alone worthy of worship and praise and honor and esteem is just so beyond these wooden and earthly gods that had no metaphysical substance except that which those who created them led to believe. And they're just a species of vanity in the next verse. But Yahweh made the heavens, and not only that, the earth, and excellence and splendor are before him. Strength and gladness are in his place. Once more, the strength, he is an inexhaustible and unlimited. Whenever we are weak, whenever we are weary, and whenever we are sad, we can lean on him who will give us the perspective to turn those frowns upside down. 30, tremble before him all the earth. The world also is firmly established, immovable. Even though the earth itself is obedient to the laws of motion, if it were to stop for even a single day to spin around the sun at the same rate it does by motion, we would all be goners. But he's calling the people on the earth to tremble before him. So even though the earth itself, is immutable and immovable and on its inexorable path of the laws of physics, he's calling the inhabitants of the earth, all of them, to tremble before the one who made them. Verse 34, give thanks to Yahweh, for he is good, for his kindness is everlasting. Therein we read another element of his eternality to bring it back to verse 15. But, just the fact of his all-encompassing goodness. Now, he alone is good. He is good. Now, when we speak of a person as a good person, that is a relative term. He is intrinsically good. And because that, we have to thank him all day, every day, throughout the day. You don't need an excuse to pray to God. You can thank him for what you already have and not necessarily what you want. Because his kindness is unending and unlimited. It is from everlasting because he is from eternity. That's all we're going to cover from the prayer itself, but in 37 we read detail. For he left Asaph and his brothers there before the ark of the covenant of Yahweh to perform regular service before the ark, as each day is required. So it wouldn't have been an ordinary procedure for a king to offer a prayer. This was a special occasion, but there were Levites and priests who attended to the details of the regular service. So after that, he brought the Ark of the Covenant. That was the solemn occasion, and he offered the prayer as the one who had recovered it. And then from henceforth, Asaph and his brothers, this would have been a family of people, and several of his descendants may have written some of the post-exilic psalms, would have been prominent at the level. And we also read, and with them Heman and Jeduthun, and the rest who were chosen, who were designated by name to give thanks to Yahweh because his kindness is everlasting. That name Heman is also familiar, at least the 88th Psalm. I could be wrong, but he is the author of at least one psalm. But these men were designated by name. They were chosen and selected, by David, but also by Yahweh himself. And the reason they were selected was to express the unending continuum of perpetual praise to him whose kindness is everlasting. 17th chapter, first verse, lesson itself. And it came to pass, when David was dwelling in his house, that David said to Nathan the prophet, See, I am indwelling in a house of cedar, but the ark of the covenant of Yahweh is under curtains. David is the king of Israel, united monarchy. This is when the kingdom of Judah and Israel were one. And he relied on a prophet. Solomon, too, had prophets who told him things. And Nathan was not the only one, but he does figure prominently on 3 occasions at least. There's also Gad. He was another one of his prophets. But Nathan is the one who did the delicate job, and it's really artful to see how he convicts David in his sin, intervening after his great moral failure. And he also is here. He is the recipient of what is called the Davidic covenant. This is the promise for a dynasty in perpetuity. We'll get to that when we get to it. This is where it all begins. And also he relayed to the king the news that his son Adonai was usurping his throne before he was even gone, and Solomon was was his chosen heir, but he was so lax in disciplining his sons that he let this thing go on with him. But those are the 3 occasions. But more to the immediate context itself, he feels a twinge of guilt, because first thing we need to know and understand about David is he's described as by God himself as a man after his own heart, Acts 13:22. So he feels guilty by the fact that he is wallowing in luxury. Look at this magnificent house, bully for me, but what about the Ark of the Covenant? I am here and it is in a tent. There is something wrong with that. So his desire to build a house of at least equal magnificence, and the temple would have been the pride and joy of Judah, what was a righteous one, but he gracefully accepts. What we read is Nathan sees nothing wrong. It is a good intention, but for reasons that are explained in the Chronicle accounts and not the Kings. David was a man of war, so he'd have been ceremonially defiled in a sense to be the one to build it. So he's under. But Nathan sees nothing wrong with it, and he gives him the go-ahead. But Nathan's prophet was to seek God's voice for him, as Job is prophet. Verse 2, And Nathan said to David, Do all that is in your heart, for Elohim is with you. Elohim was with him. He was a man whose heart was called by God himself after his own. So Nathan sees nothing wrong. This is a righteous desire. There is no trace of selfishness or conceit or pride or exalting oneself at the expense of Elohim. He looks at himself and he sees the dichotomy of what he lives in and what the ark, and by connection Yahweh himself lives in. So Nathan, he sees nothing wrong with it, but Nathan is speaking for Nathan. It is not until Yahweh visits him that corrects him. And it came to be that night that the word of Elohim came to Nathan, saying, We don't have any idea how many hours elapsed between this conversation between the king and his prophet and when he had retired to the night. We don't know what part of the day the first 2 verses occurred in, but it is later at night. And the word visit, he was a prophet, so the word, now prophets convey the word, and they speak with his authority, which is delegated by being visited by his voice. That is what you communicate and convey to the people. So this he reveals to David. He's speaking to him to speak to David. Go and Go, and you shall say to my servant David, Thus said Yahweh, you do not build a house to dwell in it. He is the master, David is the servant. He was the king, but as king he owed his position. He was exalted from the sheep pen to the throne, the throne of Israel that he now had. So he remained his servant, and the master, he doesn't. We'll read why he's saying no, but he answers his prayer. He is pleased and satisfied with the righteousness of his desire, the desire of his heart to build a house unto him. That is, but he, for reasons beyond the immediate explanation, he is not the one to do it. For I have not dwelt in a house since the time that I had brought up Israel, even to this day, but have gone from tent to tent and from temple to another. Yahweh's home is in the heavens, so the idea that a building with four walls built by man, the hands of man, can contain him as his home is just ludicrous and erroneous. But he said, I've always lived in a tent, and it means not a whole lot to me, all this beauty. Just the fact that you built it all as an expression of faithful obedience does mean something, but I'm somewhat indifferent to my lot, and I've gone from tent to tent. He had been all over the place, with them every step of the way throughout the wilderness in the form of a tent, and there hadn't been exactly stability with the Ark of the Covenant or the tabernacle. It hopped around from one place to the next. I believe it was at Gibeon before Solomon, the one who was to build the temple. His son was the one who built it. Wherever I have moved about with all Israel, have I spoken a word to any of the rulers of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar? Cedar would have been the luxury item. This would have adorned the houses of kings and not a whole lot of other people. But the shepherd, now David was a literal shepherd before he became a shepherd of people, a shepherd of a nation. And the vocations, he was willing to kill lions and bears in defense of his sheep, and so too would he do for the sheep of his people Israel. But Yahweh of hosts is his military name, and once more David is degraded to the status of servant. He wouldn't object. He considered himself that. He wanted to do this to please his master, but his master does not deny the righteousness of his request, only tells him that for reasons he's not going to do it. But the thing about Yahweh is he is not an Elohim of explanations. He is an Elohim of promises. So even though he rejects this idea, this ambition, this righteous ambition of his servant David, he gives him a promise of which we're going to read eventually. And now say this to my servant David, Thus said Yahweh of hosts, I took you from the sheepfold to following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. David was not born a prince. He was not even a noble. He was the son of an obscure citizen from the town of Bethlehem in Judah. His Jesse's grandfather would have been Ruth, the woman of whom we read between the books of Judges and 1 Samuel, the short 4-book, but that is included just as an expression of his mercy and also his providence. But David would have been he would have been the shepherd of the family, and he did tend to sheep at a very tender age. So shepherding was dangerous, but David overcame and triumphed over the danger. He was willing to put his life, with the presence and power of Yahweh with him, enabled him to kill lions and kill strengths, and also enabled him to kill Goliath. So after he killed Goliath, the life of the shepherd would never be the same. He would have been the prize figure, the hero of all the land, all of Israel. And from there, he proved that he was his anointed, and the anointment gradually withered away from Saul, his successor. We read of his death in the 10th chapter of 1 Chronicles. But so his path to power, his path to the throne was not the ordinary one. He was the one who founded a dynasty, so he was not a prince, far less even a noble, far less even a prince. He was just a humble shepherd boy who was a man after God's own heart, and more importantly, God was with him. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies before you, and have made you a name like the name of the great men who are on the earth. David wouldn't have disagreed with this when Nathan relays the contents of this. He does acknowledge that it was not by his might, but by the power of him that he was able to overcome every enemy and obstacle. David did not suffer of delusions of his own specialness. It was by his strength, but he did, he was the one who did play his part, so we shouldn't, just eliminate any credit altogether from David. But ultimately, and in the ultimate and final analysis, it was the strength of God and that alone that enabled David to do these things, to triumph consistently over one's military enemies and to consistently emerge victorious. And his name and reputation for greatness would have spread far and wide. He would have been the terror and dread of a lot of the nations around him. And I shall prepare a place for my people Israel, and plant them, and they shall dwell in a place of their own, and move no more, nor shall the sons of wickedness oppress them any more, as the first. Prior to this point, during the period of Judges, which spanned some 350 years before Israel had a king on the throne, they were ruled by judges. There was no stable mechanism for the transfer of authority to the next. What happened is the period of Judges, Israel underwent cycles of apostasy-induced oppression, and they would repent and they would cry out mightily when they were on the ground, just being oppressed and humiliated by the foreign captors. So that went on for about 350 years, but this was a new era, the dawn of a new day. Israel would henceforth be secure from their enemies. So Solomon and David collectively represent a golden age of rulership. David is the model monarch. But what's interesting in the Chronicle accounts is that it is a whitewashing of sorts. There is no mention of David's sin with Uriah. There is mention of his sin with taking the census in the 21st chapter. But Solomon also, his succumbing to adultery, his life ends without the abrupt and inexplicable descent and decline into idolatry and death that the king's account has. But here he's presented as a messianic figure, so the term son has an echo with the one who is to build the temple and also the one whose dynasty David offered to give God a house, but he gives him instead a dynasty. Since the time that I command rulers to be over my people Israel, I have humbled all your enemies, and I declare to you that Yahweh builds you a house. So the house of Israel, the house of a nation, just the structure and foundation were founded by him and him alone. So he has, he was the power through whom David vanquished all rival foes, all enemies, all contenders, all these other people that were vying for his neck and just after him in every way, shape, and form. So even though he offered to build Yahweh a house, who was living in a tent, the ark at least was, Yahweh, his home is in the heavens, but he's going to build him a house because he's so satisfied and pleased with the righteousness of his request that even though he denies the prayer, he does give him a promise for something even better. Because he wanted to be the one to build his house, God would build his house. And it shall be when your days are filled to be with your fathers, that I shall raise up your seed after you, who is of your sons, and I shall establish his kingdom. So this is actually an endorsement of the resurrection when you shall be with your ancestors, your fathers. That means he's going to, and the life after next, he's going to join his his ancestors, the ones who came before him, so there is life after death. But while he is up there in heaven, on earth, his earth as a king, he would have had earthly concerns, but he's promising that his seed, the immediate offspring, Solomon, the kingdom would function and flourish as it never had before. And David played a part in that. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes 3rd chapter, a time for war and a time for peace. So the providential purpose of their reigns was David was the one who secured the boundaries, the borders, and just, made an Israel a force to be reckoned with on the geopolitical stage. But Solomon, that enabled Solomon to pursue the path of peace and diplomacy to enrich the promised land beyond beyond any level that they would ever know again. He builds me a house, and I shall establish his throne forever. So the chronicler is writing in the post-exilic period, during which time the throne of David had ceased to exist. So he is speaking both immediately, the one who builds the house, his throne will not last. It certainly wasn't around when the chronicler wrote what he wrote, but his throne is going to be forever. This is the promise which finds its ultimate fulfillment in the biological descendant of David, 28 generations removed in Matthew, but not every generation, only 28 generations listed. Matthew presents his genealogy in a symmetrical form. 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to Zedekiah, then 14 from the other period. I am to be his father, and he is to be my son. In my kindness I do not turn away from him, as I took it away from him who was before you. So even though Saul was anointed, and this was in response to an unrighteous request, because Israel's persistent demand that they abandoned their theocracy where Yahweh was to be their king, but they wanted a human king to just, because everyone else around them had them, so they had lost sight of their exceptionalness. So God sent them Saul. He raised up a man who was, a mighty warrior, brilliant, handsome, tall, head and shoulders above just about every other man in Israel. But this was his punishment because Saul was morally mediocre, to be charitable. So he vanquished he had no dynasty because his sons died with him on the day that he died. They were there on the same day, but the dynasty he lost, even though there was no throne of David in Jerusalem to speak of by the time that the Chronicles were written, and equally so at the time that the fulfillment, the manifestation, the king who came to the earth as a lamb and a babe in a manger, just not in the palace life, a babe in a straw hut in an obscure town. So that's the ultimate fulfillment of the promise. So this now in immediate reference to Solomon, there is no mention, as there is in the Samuel version in the 7th chapter of Samuel, no mention of any consequences for disobedience, and that's because Chronicles, once more, is a whitewashing. And I shall establish him in my house, in my kingdom forever, and his throne to be established forever. So the reason that the chronicler includes this, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, is to give them the hope of the Messiah, the one who springs from eternity. This is what he means. So the Messiah is the eternal one who was in the beginning, before the beginning, from the beginning. He's the Alpha and the Omega, same yesterday, today, and forever. But he will be, that is the one whose throne will be established forever. So the Davidic dynasty, the earthly dynasty, would cease to exist, but through his loins would spring the one who sprang from eternity. According to all these words, and according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak to David. That was the prophet's job, to faithfully and honestly and accurately communicate the word, and that they had been. So this vision may have entailed a visionary component, but what's important here is the verbal element, what is communicated to him. And David's response, his righteous response of gratitude and prayer, is what forms the subsequent section of the 17th chapter. So he So Nathan does what he does, and then David, is obedient and faithful to his job, and so too is David grateful for getting better than he even bargained for, just to have the promise that the Messiah would spring from his loins. And it all began with Judah, Genesis, and even before that with the seed born of the woman, Genesis 3:15, and then Micah 5:2. But we're ultimately running out of time, so we're going to close this lesson up. Thank you so much for being here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. See you next time. Bye-bye.